Hey you guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today we are talking about the fall to winter transition. Where do these bass go? How do they move? Where do they position? And most importantly, how to catch them. We're going to talk about the different baits that you can have confidence in as we cool down going into winter, heading into those colder, cooler months where the fishing historically gets a little bit tougher. To kick this off, we're going to talk about exactly how these fish are positioning and where they're positioning from right now in the middle of fall all the way through winter. Then we'll circle back around and talk about the specific baits and lures and how to use them most effectively. So focusing in on where these fish go. If you guys have been with us this entire year, we've kept this series going, explaining fish behavior and how they move. So during this transition, the fish actually get access to a much larger lake than they had before. If you're on a shallow body of water, it's not as big of a deal. If you're on a large reservoir with deeper water access, things are changing in a huge way right now. During the fall transition, we have the turnover, where the lake and the water in the lake actually begin to mix and ultimately all swirl together and equalize. It's a huge change in temperature variation in the water. It's a video in and of itself. So for now, we're going to leave it at just that. But what matters about that, why it applies to you, is that during the warmer months, there's a thermocline in the water. Essentially, the fish will only go so deep. Once they pass this magical line, this thermocline, there's very poor water quality, lower oxygen levels. So the fish are sort of corralled into a smaller part of the lake. Well, as we go through fall, that changes. Everything equalizes, very similar water conditions from top to bottom, and I'm talking deep. So all of a sudden, bass in a lake that may not have been going past 15 or 20 or 30 feet deep can now go 50, 60, 80, 100 plus feet deep without any issues. That's the bad news. The good news is that while this lake got much larger, the areas that they can go got much larger, the fish congregate together more than any other time of year. They bunch up into very tight locations, often mixing species. You'll find bass, catfish, panfish, all these different fish together in really small locations. So even though it can be at any depth range, the actual locations are small, and once you find them, the best news of all is it's extremely consistent throughout the entire winter. They rarely abandon an area. As we get colder and colder and colder. Now, cold varies from one place to another. Out here where we are, this is Clear Lake in California. Water temps here typically just get down to the high 30s, low 40s. If we have a cold winter, it'll get all the way down to about 36 degrees, but we rarely get colder than that. Obviously, guys in the north, your water is going to freeze up. Guys in the south, you don't get anywhere near as cold. So that will be a factor in how tight these fish bunch. The colder the water, the more they congregate, the more they bunch up, and the more they just focus on survival. Less on eating because their metabolisms are low during those cold months. So less on eating, more on just getting through it. But that doesn't mean that you can't catch them. We will circle back on the baits in just a moment. So the actual locations, let's focus on that. Where do you start your search? These fish are headed towards deep water access. Typically, your steeper, rockier banks are where the fish are going to focus. That way they can make small moves. They don't want to travel way back into a shallow bay to feed this time of year and then have to come back out. That doesn't work well for them because, again, metabolism is low, water is cold, they don't want to make big moves, they don't want to move quickly, they just want to stay in one place, eat enough to survive, and get through the cold months. So anywhere where you've got steep rock that accesses very deep water, but can immediately pop up out of it. So steep, deep water points, deep ledges, probably the biggest one, bluff walls. Those truly deep rock edges are key this time of year. Now, if you're on a lake that has hundreds of miles of bluff walls, what do? How do you narrow it down? So here's what you do. It's not just about steep walls and rock walls. It's about places that funnel fish. So they're going to choose, if they've got an area where there's a lot of steep, deep rock, they're going to choose the points, the spots that anything has to travel around. If they just set up anywhere in the middle of a wall, there's only so much food that's going to come to them. But if they set up out on the tip of a long tapering point and then it breaks off to deep water, everything will have to come around that point. They've got easy access to food there. Anywhere that it funnels down, it pinches. If your lake has a narrow section where the two sides of the lake funnel down and come together, that narrowest point, that's where those fish will be, because more food will come through there than anywhere else, and it's easier for them to survive the cold months. Pretty simple. As far as depth, that's going to vary. You're going to have to experiment with that. You can find them in 5 to 10 feet. You can find them in 20, 30, 40, 50, and deeper. But again, once you find them, you've got them. They very rarely make large moves this time of year because they don't want to travel and because the water conditions are very stable. There's no reason to travel. Nothing is making big moves. So once you find a congregation of fish, you've got them. After that, the focus needs to be on how to catch those fish. Are you going to focus on trying to get them to react? Or are you going to try and focus on fooling them, meaning presenting something that's extremely natural and actually luring them in to eat it? You have two options there. Here in a second, we'll transition. So again, steeper banks, rock is key. They love rock in the wintertime. If your lake has no rock, say you're on a smaller body of water, a pond, something like that, what you want to focus on is the hollows, the deepest water. So if you're on a pond that's 5, 10, 20, 100 acres, but doesn't have a lot of features, if it's a large bowl, they'll be in the deepest part of that bowl, right in the center. Even if there's no structure or cover or anything to hold them there, they'll choose that low point. It's very consistent. In a lake that has a couple of little fingers, but again, not very deep, they'll sit right in the hollow, the center of each one of those fingers. Very simple. All right, let's change gears and let's talk about the actual baits. Now, cooling water doesn't mean that you have to fish ultra slow all the time. In fact, there are some exceptions to the rule where you can actually fish quite quickly. We're going to cover that later in winter. We'll come back to some of that stuff when it's more relevant. But general rule of thumb, you want to fish slower, more methodically, and with baits that don't have too much action as the water cools down. You know, middle of fall, you might still be throwing a lipless crankbait, bottom hopping. We've talked about that before. Well, as you get towards winter, you switch over to a blade bait. This is a Demiki Vault, one of the best blade baits that we've ever used. Blade bait, think Silver Buddy. That's where it all got started. It's a vibrating blade, much like a lipless crankbait, only it's solid. It's lead and steel. Fishes the same way. You'll feel it vibrate when you pull it up, let it fall. Pull it up, let it fall. So we're not just talking about going out and worming all winter long. You have a lot of really fun ways to catch these fish, but you need to be strategic. You need to be careful with the baits that you're throwing. So something like a blade or a spoon, that 1 3/4 ounce does spoon that you guys see us talking about all the time, this is prime time for baits like this, and they will continue to work into and through winter. Some other really good options, as that water's really getting cold, the jerkbait becomes a huge player. And I actually forgot to bring my jerkbait box with me, but you guys know from our most recent jerkbait video, the baits that have dynamite action. Well, this time of year, you want to get down lower in the water column. So the two that I would focus on are that Lucky Craft Stacy 90 or that Megabass Vision 110+1. That one that we could barely even get underwater footage of for you because it was cutting so far on its movements from side to side. That bait is just dialed, and they get down deep, they suspend well. As that water gets colder, you want to fish a jerkbait slower and slower and slower. So rip, rip, long pauses. 2 seconds, 5, 10 seconds, 10 seconds, even longer, and then rip, and then wait again. See, the idea this time of year, 2 different ways of thinking. One is fool a fish. Put a bait down there that looks good and get them to eat it. Number 2 is be aggressive, be fast moving, get a reaction strike out of the fish. So that jerkbait is great because it's a little bit of both worlds. A jerkbait will get down there and it'll sit, and that fish will look at it and it won't be moving, and they'll look and look and look and look, and then it rips. And when it rips, just a pure reaction strike, they lash out and they eat it. That's why it's such a good option this time of year. Some other options. We're gonna go this direction here in a minute, but we'll come back. A couple more small options first. The small swim bait. The small swim bait is a dynamite option all the way through the wintertime, with or without a blade. This is that little cool baits, 1/8 ounce. You can throw this on 6-pound line. Really light line, but you're still getting a great swim bait profile. A little 2.8 Kitech on the back of that. You just slow fish right along the bottom. Even if the blade is not moving, it's down there banging into things, making sound and commotion, the fish eat it really well. Now, rule of thumb on the blade in the wintertime, if your water is clearer, no blade, just the bare swim bait, guppy head. If you've got a little stain to the water, that blade will help pull those fish in. But I can't emphasize enough how slow I want you to fish these little baits this time of year, and especially as it gets colder. The jig, always a huge factor in the winter months. You can fish it ultra slow. I actually believe that a jig will work in colder water than a swim bait. The swim bait bite will stop. The jig will keep going all the way down in the low to mid 30s as long as you fish it ultra slow. I believe that as that water gets really cold, nothing in the water is really moving fast. So when you're really dragging bottom, you're fishing for those lethargic fish that are sitting right down in the cover. And the slower you move that bait, the better, because it gives them time to just look at it and decide if that's something they want to eat and come down and get it. If you're hopping it, the way I like to fish it in the summertime, that big double hop, if you're doing that stuff, I don't think it looks natural to those fish because not very many things are moving on the bottom that quickly in the winter. So I focus on just that slow pull. Just pull it and stop. Really simple. Football jig is perfect this time of year. Double tail grub. Now, we'll link all the gear down in the video description for you, of course. And then the last of the small baits is going to be a drop shot. But I want to be really specific with the drop shot worms. There are some worms, and you guys know this because we talked about it in some of our recent videos. We went underwater and looked at a variety of drop shot baits. Some of them look best when you're just shaking them. Constant movement. That's when they look their best. Well, again, that same thing. I don't think that that quite looks right in that ultra cold water. Some of the baits, like this guy from Big Bite, this one stood out to me because it looked so good on those larger hops, and then it would just fall. That's a bait that in the wintertime, if you fish it on a little bit longer line, a little longer distance between your hook and your weight, where you can give that bait a good hop and then just kill it and let that thing settle and move all the way down to bottom, and then a little pop back up. It's none of the shaking. It's just let that thing settle. It's almost like a jerk bait, where that bait's settling, it looks good, they're thinking about it, and then it pops up and floats again. Kind of a cross between a jerk bait and like a really natural spoon, where you're going for that fluttering fall. So pay attention to the style of worm that you are throwing during those cold water months. Make sure it's a worm that will look good with that slower motion. That's important. And then at the other end of the spectrum is the swim bait. So during those coldest water months, where bass are lethargic, they're hesitant to feed, There's basically two ways to catch them. One is, well, there's three. One is a true reaction bite, which can happen. And again, we'll get to that later. But it's a narrower opportunity. Most of the time, you're either going ultra slow with the little bait, just slow playing it, and just trying to get a fish to just decide to eat it. At the other end of the spectrum, you have big baits, something like the 8-inch Huddleston or the big trash fish. These are baits that are worth the effort for the fish to eat. If they eat 20 of these or one of these, they end up in the same position, right? They're just trying to get something to eat. If they can find a slow-moving big bait, that is a great meal to help a bass get through the cold months. So this is the time of year when these are most successful. I chose these two baits specifically. The Huddleston is a dynamite winter bait because that tail movement is so subtle and it works at just the world's slowest crawl, just as slow as you can stand to go along the bottom. And all of a sudden, thunk, and you better hit them hard when you feel that thump. The other one, the trash fish, it's a paddle tail style or a boot tail rather than that vortex style tail. Typically these don't work as well in the cold water, but this bait is so soft that it just always has a little bit of movement. That's another great option. And again, now this one you can rig weedless. You can do a lot of different things with it, but again, ultra slow. Ultra slow is key. Just down there on the bottom, bumping into each and every rock and nosing up over it. Next rock, nosing over it. That's what it takes to get those giant bites when that water is in the high 30s, low 40s, high 40s. Once you get above that, the game starts to change, but that's not until we get all the way back around to spring. So again, on the baits, you can go small, you can go big, you can go finesse, but you don't have to. Otherwise, continue to have a great time. Fish those baits that are fun. Throw that blade bait, throw that spoon, throw the jig, throw the small swim bait. You might be amazed just how much fun you can have and how many fish you can catch all the way through winter. The water never gets cold enough that a bass doesn't need to eat. They don't need to eat as often, but they still need to eat. You can have a great time from here all the way through till spring. I hope this video helps you. I hope it inspires you to get out there on the water. You don't have to take time off. Fishing goes all year long, and there are some great fish out there just waiting to be caught. Guys, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk to you soon.